This now brings me to the topic of the two speeches that Putin and Shoigu delivered at this expo in Moscow. Now, I should say that both of these speeches were delivered to an international audience. There were lots of military officials and diplomats and all these sort of people from around the world, not from the West, of course, but from the global South, from China, from India, from Latin America, from Africa, attending this expo exhibition in Moscow, where the Russians were showing this Western equipment and talking about their own weapon systems, and were staging these games, these military games. And it's interesting, first of all, that Shoigu delivered a speech which, as we will see, was as long and as consequential and covered as much ground as Putin's speech. It's as if these two, Putin and Shoigu, were equals, instead of Putin being, the president, the overall commander-in-chief, and Shoigu being purely the subordinate. And one would expect in an event like this that it would be Putin who would deliver the big main speech, and Shoigu, as the actual host, this is after all the Ministry of Defense event, that Shoigu would deliver a shorter speech, simply welcoming the delegates, perhaps supporting some of the things that Putin has said. But it wasn't like that. These were two speeches, as I said, of comparable length, comparable complexity, covering a huge range of issues. Shoigu discussed matters well beyond his defense minister's brief. And I have to say I found that interesting. Now, I am not one of those people who engages in that esoteric science of Kremlinology, of trying to work out who is, the rising star in the Kremlin and whose star is fading and who the successor to Putin might be. I find that an almost hopeless exercise, by the way. But the fact that Shoigu was given this amount of attention in front of a foreign audience, a largely foreign audience, I do find interesting in itself. And dare I say it, it's almost as if he was being prepared for this audience for a much more enhanced political role. In other words, conceivably, perhaps he's been slated, but perhaps he's been presented as someone who might eventually be Putin's successor. Now, if so, I would say that I would find that a little surprising, given that Shoigu and Putin are roughly the same age. And of course, Putin is likely to remain president of Russia for quite a long time. But anyway, for what it's worth, I was surprised that Shoigu was given, alongside Putin, as much time as he was, and that he delivered a speech as dense and as substantive as Putin's own. But let's put all that speculation about Kremlin politics to one side. As I said, I'm always very dubious about that kind of thing myself. Let's focus instead on the content of these speeches, because they're extremely interesting. And we'll turn first to Putin's. And he spoke as follows. I'm not going to read the entire speech, but I'm going to deal with the geopolitical aspects of it, and if you like, in some ways, the philosophical aspects of it. And so, after his introductory comments, Putin goes on to say the following: the situation in the world is changing dynamically, and the outlines of a multipolar world order are taking shape. An increasing number of countries and peoples are choosing a path of free and sovereign development based on their own distinct identity, traditions, and values. These objective processes are being opposed by the Western globalist elites. Now, let's stop at this point, because I just want to single out this phrase, Western globalist elites. Many of us heard lots of people use this expression, globalization, talk about globalists, the globalists and their policies in the West. As far as I can remember, this is the first time that Putin actually talks about globalists. He doesn't use that expression exactly. He talks about Western globalist elites. He wants to make the point that these are elite people and that they're entirely from the West. But he is effectively talking about globalists, about people in the West who pursue a globalist project. Now, he's talked about a globalist project in the past, held by some people in the West, but now he says that there are actually globalists who have an ideological commitment to this project. Anyway, these objective processes are being opposed by the Western globalist elites who provoke chaos. Now, in program after program, in live stream after live stream, Alex Christoforou and I were asked by people about whether in fact all these problems that take place in the world aren't actually deliberately induced chaos on the parts of globalists or the globalist elite in order to facilitate their policy of globalization. Well, here we have no less a person than the president of Russia saying that very thing, that these objective processes, that's the processes towards multipolarity, towards countries and peoples choosing a path of free and sovereign development based on their own distinct identity, traditions and values, that those processes are being opposed by a Western globalist elites, by globalists in other words, and that one of the mechanisms they use is to promote chaos. They are using chaos to promote globalization. That's not being said by the usual people who are dismissed with various words of mockery by all kinds of people in the West, in mainstream media and the rest. This is now being said by no less a person than the president of Russia. Anyway, he continues, who provoke chaos, fanning long-standing and new conflicts and pursuing the so-called containment policy, which in fact amounts to the subversion of any alternative sovereign development options. Thus, they are doing all they can to keep hold on to the hegemony and power that are slipping from their hands. They're attempting to retain countries and peoples in their grip, in the grip of what is essentially a neocolonial order. Of course, the word neocolonial order here is used very advisedly because, of course, Putin is addressing an audience of the global south, of countries that experienced Western colonialism directly. Their hegemony means stagnation for the rest of the world and for the entire civilization. It means obscurantism, cancellation of culture, and neoliberal totalitarianism. Just a few days ago, we were doing a program on the Duran, and I said that, in my opinion, what is called liberalism today bears very little resemblance to the liberalism of people like Voltaire, which was very keen on allowing freedom for people to express themselves. Voltaire made that famous phrase, about, I mean, well, he didn't actually, but it's often attributed to him, in which supposedly Voltaire said that, I may not agree with you, but I will fight to the death for your right to say that which you believe. And I said that modern liberals, or so-called liberals, neoliberals if you prefer, no longer think in that way. They're busy suppressing all opinions or expressions of opinions that they don't like. And I said that this has a totalitarian trend. Well, here we see, a couple of days later, no less a person than the president of Russia talking about neoliberal totalitarianism. Now, you find similar criticisms of so-called liberals uttered by all sorts of people. I'm not going to embarrass them by saying who they are, who are these critics, but those who follow alternative media will know. Well, the president of Russia agrees. He also thinks that there is a totalitarian strain within what he doesn't call liberalism, but he's careful to call neoliberalism. To continue, they're using all expedients. The United States and its vassals grossly interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign states by staging provocations, organizing coups, or inciting civil wars. By threats, blackmail, and pressure, they're trying to force independent states to submit to their will and follow rules that are alien to them. The last, clearly, of course, alludes to the social and identity and lifestyle politics that have become so important in the West. This is being done with just one aim, which is to preserve their domination, the centuries-old model that enables them to sponge on everything in the world. But a model of this sort can only be retained by force. Anyway, this is why the collective West, the so-called collective West, is deliberately undermining the European security system and knocking together ever new military alliances. NATO is crawling east and building up its military infrastructure. And then he talks a great deal about the problems that has caused Russia and the way in which Russia tried to deal with these problems by negotiation and how that failed. And then he goes on to say, Putin goes on to say, they need conflicts to retain their hegemony. It is for this reason that they have destined the Ukrainian people to be used as cannon fodder. They have implemented the anti-Russia project and connived at the dissemination of, and anyway, he now talks about an ideology. He uses the label for that ideology, but of course he's referring to the ideology that gained prominence in Europe in the 1930s. And then he talks about this is the reason why Russia was obliged to launch its special military operation in Ukraine. And then he talks about how the United States, the Western powers, are trying to use the same mechanisms all around the world. And he then specifically refers to the Taiwan issue. As is common knowledge, the US has recently made another deliberate attempt to fuel the flames and stir up trouble in the Asia-Pacific. The US escapade towards Taiwan is not just a voyage by an irresponsible politician, but part of the purpose-oriented and deliberate US strategy designed to destabilize the situation and sow chaos in the region and the world. So the Pelosi visit to Taiwan was part of a deliberate strategy on the part of the US of creating destabilization, of wrecking relationships, of creating areas of tension, all as part of the overall project to promote globalization. And he then has some things to say about the effect of all of this on Western living standards, By taking these actions, the Western globalist elites, note he's again using that expression, globalist elites are attempting, amongst other things, to divert the attention of their own citizens from pressing socio-economic problems such as plummeting living standards, unemployment, poverty, and deindustrialization. They want to shift the blame for their own failures to other countries, namely Russia and China. Note the pairing of the two, which are defending their point of view and designing a sovereign development policy without submitting to the diktat of the supranational elites. So he uses the expression Western globalist elites again, and now he calls them supranational elites. They're not engaged in looking after their own people, whose living standards, on the contrary, are plummeting. They are instead focused on spreading their globalist model. And they do that through spreading chaos, setting country off against country, and by destabilizing situations and by creating conflicts. And then he talks about AUKUS being another alliance system that they're trying to create. The Western globalist elites are trying to create. This is the alliance between the United States and Australia and New Zealand and Japan and all of those in the Pacific region. And then he ends by saying, I reiterate that the era of the unipolar world is becoming a thing of the past. No matter how strongly the beneficiaries of the current globalist model, note the word globalist model, cling to the familiar state of affairs, it is doomed. The historic geopolitical changes are going in a totally different direction. And then he goes on to say, I want to emphasize that the multipolar world, based on international law and more just relations, opens up new opportunities. And then he discusses what those are: for countering threats, for improving living standards, and for securing peace. So he's not only repudiating globalization in this whole speech, he's also identifying elites in the Western countries as promoting globalization. He says that they use chaos to achieve globalization. He says that as part of this globalization project, they're prepared to foment wars, to impose alien ideas and ideologies and social policies and lifestyles on people. And he says, in other words, many of the very same things that Western critics of globalization have said. And he says that China and Russia together, allies in all but name, are the force that is standing in the way of this globalization model. And this is why they're being targeted by these Western globalist elites, which, though Western, because they are all drawn from people in the West, are actually supranational. They have no loyalty to their own populations, whose living standards are plummeting. Now, as I said, you're going to find lots of people in various websites, media places, independent platforms who talk about all of this. But this is the president of Russia who's talking. And he's talking about all of this to people from the global south. And he's telling them, this is a new form of colonialism. If you submit to this, if you allow yourself to be caught up in this, you will face a new colonial mechanism which will be as disastrous for you economically as the previous straightforward colonial system was. Powerful words, words that, as I said, Putin would not have spoken just a few years ago, but words which I have no doubt at all reflect his inner convictions. Now, that's Putin. And let's now turn to Shoigu. And as I said, Shoigu's speech is actually longer. And it covers much of the same ground. And I find that very interesting. But he also talks about the progress of the military operation in Ukraine. And I'm going to again read excerpts from this speech. The speech again is very long, as I said, longer even than Putin's. But I'm going to say a few things. I'm going to read excerpts and people can get some sense of what Shoigu said. So he says that, starting now what he says. This conference comes at a time of radical change in global and regional security. The unconditional dominance of the United States and its allies is a thing of the past. On February 24th, 2022, the start of the special military operation in Ukraine marked the end of the unipolar world. Multipolarity has become a reality. The poles of this world are clearly defined. The main difference between them is that some respect the interests of sovereign states and take into account the cultural and historical particularities of countries and peoples, whilst others disregard them. There have been numerous discussions on this topic during previous sessions of the Moscow Conference. And then to continue, he says, in Europe, the security situation is worse than at the peak of the Cold War. The alliance's military activities have become as aggressive and anti-Russian as possible. Significant US forces have been redeployed to the continent, and the number of coalition troops in Eastern and Central Europe has increased manifold. It is important to note that the deployment of additional NATO joint force formations on the bloc's eastern flank had already started before the start of the special military operation in Ukraine. NATO has dropped its mask. The aggressive nature of the bloc was no longer concealed by the wording of the coalition's purely defensive orientation. Together, NATO's strategic planning documents enshrine claims to global dominance. The alliance's interests include Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific Rim. In the West's view, the established system of international relations should be replaced by a so-called rules-based world order. The logic here is simple and has the form of ultimata. Either the alliance's democratic partner candidate loses sovereignty and becomes supposedly on the right side of history, or it is relegated to the category of a so-called authoritarian regime against which all kinds of measures up to and including coercive pressure can be used. And then Shoigu goes on to discuss a great deal about the military operations in Ukraine. And he says the following: the supply of weapons and military equipment to Ukraine is being stepped up, and training of the Ukrainian army is being carried out. Huge financial resources are transferred to maintain the viability of the Ukrainian regime. The actions of Ukraine's armed forces are planned and coordinated by foreign military advisors. Reconnaissance data is supplied from all available NATO sources. The use of armaments is supervised by Western specialists. NATO's efforts are aimed at prolonging the agony of the Kiev regime. However, we know for a fact that no one in NATO has any doubt that the goals of the Russian leadership's special military operation will be achieved, and that plans to strategically and economically weaken Russia are failing. Well, that's a very interesting last statement. How do the Russians know that for a fact? Well, they do have a very extensive intelligence apparatus. If that is right, then I ask again that question I asked in so many videos. If the West knows that its operations in Ukraine are failing, that the Ukrainian project is ending in a debacle. Why do they carry on with it? What is the logic of this war at this point? But anyway, I'm not going to repeat myself on that. You've probably heard me say that many, many times. Let me now go on to what he says about Western weapon systems. The special military operation has dispelled the myth of super weapons supplied to Ukraine by the West, which are capable of fundamentally changing the situation on the front. Initially, they were talking about deliveries of Javelin anti-tank missiles, Javelin anti-tank systems, some kind of unique drones. Lately, the Westerners have been promoting the role of super weapons with HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems and long-range howitzers. These weapons also grind to a halt in battle. They have not made any significant impact. Russian weapons, for their part, have proved their best qualities in combat. We are taking a close look at the trophy weapons from the West. The features and their specific qualities are taken into account in order to prove the way combat operations are conducted and the effectiveness of Russian armaments. And then he has a lot to say about the fact that Ukrainian armed forces operations are planned in Washington, in London. Not only are coordinates of the targets to be attacked provided by Western intelligence, but the input of this data into Western systems is conducted under the full control of Western specialists. That would suggest, by the way, that if we're talking about HIMARS launchers, that there are Western specialists there with the HIMARS launchers in Ukraine itself, literally where the launchers are themselves positioned. In which case, by the way, it's likely, if the Russians are telling the truth and they have destroyed some of these launchers, that some of these Western specialists have also been killed. Anyway, just mentioning this. I'm not saying it's the case, by the way. This derives from things that Shoigu is saying. He may be wrong, or he may be engaging in a little disinformation here, but that's what he says. And then he talks about the Ukraine's combat losses. Kiev's role in the West's combat approach has been reduced to supplying manpower, which is seen as expendable. This explains the huge loss of personnel in Ukraine's armed forces and territorial defense formations. So far, the real figures of dead soldiers and mobilized so-called territorial defense forces have been concealed by the Kiev leadership. In time, however, this information will become public. The testimonies of POWs allow us to form a realistic picture of what is happening on the other side of the front. The dismissive attitude towards the loss of foreign soldiers reinforces the thesis that NATO has purely selfish interests in Ukraine. And then Shoigu goes after the British specifically. He says, clearly, Britain's colonial experience as the main sponsor of the Kiev regime has come in very handy for London in dealing with the current leadership in Kiev. Well, I think we're going to do a program eventually about the British role in this conflict, but I'm not going to discuss it now. And then Shoigu goes on in a massive tour de horizon, as the French would say. He discusses global affairs. He talks about AUKUS. He talks about the Soviet Union's victory over Japan at the end of the Second World War. He talks about strategic arms limitation and the way that is completely broken down. He has talked about the collapse of conventional force limitations and reductions in Europe. He talks about Syria and what has been going on there and the war in Syria. He talks about Afghanistan. He talks about Africa and the way in which Africa has now become a battlefield, a battleground, a geopolitical battleground between the Eurasian forces and the West. He talks about media campaigns in Latin America. He talked about launched by the West, and all of this within the framework of this great conflict between Russia and its geopolitical allies and the Western powers who are promoting this policy of globalization. Again, I have to say, I repeat what I said earlier, it's unusual for a subordinate to the Russian president to be given an opportunity to speak at this extraordinary length on world affairs, touching on foreign policy and what is going on in region after region, Latin America, Africa, etc., well beyond, you would think, his actual remit. And I wonder why. But anyway, let's put all that aside. Two clear takes here. First of all, my impression was that both Putin and Shoigu, especially Shoigu, came across as supremely confident. They are clearly feeling that they are winning. They're winning the economic war against the West. They are winning the military conflict in Ukraine. They are winning the battle for ideas around the world. There was nothing pleading about these speeches. They were delivered in an extraordinarily confident way. And film I've seen of Putin in particular, he looked extremely relaxed. I haven't seen film of Shoigu, but I suspect it's the same of him too. So two very confident speeches. The second is, it's now clear that the Russian leadership has completely accepted the globalization thesis as an explanation for Western actions. They don't see themselves pitched so much against the West and its people, but rather against a globalist elite located in the West and in control of the West. And they see that globalist elite willing to spread chaos, to incite conflicts as it tries to maintain its grip and at the same time expand its area of control and achieve this globalist project. Now that is, to my mind, a remarkable revelation that the Russian leadership thinks in that kind of way and promotes those ideas. Until very recently, criticism of globalization was a marginal thing. You would not have seen any government around the world adopt it. Now, one of the world's most powerful governments, that of Russia, has done so. I suspect that this is something which other governments will quietly and gradually start to do as well. The Chinese government sort of does. On the one hand, it still talks about globalization being a good thing, but of course when it talks about globalization, what it really means is free access to China, to world markets. China explicitly repudiates the idea of a rules-based international order and asserts, as Russia does, a world based on sovereign states, anchored in international law and the UN Charter, something completely different from globalization. So China is already edging towards the Russian position, even if they do sometimes, for their own reasons, give the odd nod, at least to the label globalization, though as I said they mean something else by it. But I suspect that before very long, more and more countries are going to follow where Russia has led and are going to come out and speak openly about globalization and about the globalist elite, and they're going to openly repudiate it. This is something new. Shoigu talked about the masks having fallen. And of course, he referred specifically there to NATO. But in a way, you could say the same is true of Russia. The Russians have been very measured and careful up to now to talk the talk, to limit themselves to the kind of language the West uses to appear, if you like, to adhere to Western nostrums and positions on the framework of international relations. It's now quite clear that deep down they reject those ideas. They reject the entire globalization project, and they don't just reject it, they now see themselves as opposing it, and they see themselves as the leader opposing it. And they not only see themselves as the leader opposing it, they believe that most of the world agrees with them. Now, that is something new. I wonder how the West will react to this, whether Western leaders will see that they're now involved in ideological conflict, just as they were during the Cold War, and whether the frame of, that this is democracies versus autocracies is now going to be sustainable. The Russians will say that it's sovereigntists versus globalists, not democracies versus autocracies. They will say that, on the contrary, it is they who stand for democracy and the Western globalist elites who reject it. We'll see how Western elites confront this challenge. But challenge it now is. And once the war in Ukraine ends, and Shoigu has made it absolutely clear that it can only end now with a Russian victory, once the war ends and the West has lost, this struggle for ideas, a struggle of ideas on top of the geopolitical struggle, will begin in earnest. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this long video on this complex subject. Overlong video perhaps, but this is an intricate discussion about intricate things. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE and Telegram. And of course, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. And please also remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.